The candles in the great hall of Ashcroft Park burned 40 strong that December evening, and their light reached far enough down the servants' passage to find Edith where she knelt on the cold flags, her scrubbing brush still in her hand, her apron darkened at the knees. Above her, through the plaster and the oak boards, she could hear the 30 dinner guests arranged around Lord Ashcroft's table, the low percussion of crystal and silver, the practiced laughter of people who had never once wondered whether the floor beneath their chairs was clean. She had made it clean. She had made it clean for 3 years without their noticing, which was, she supposed, the precise proof that she had done it correctly. It was Lady Morrow's voice that carried, as Lady Morrow's voice always did, with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent 6 decades certain that she was worth overhearing. "The charwoman," she said to the footman posted at the passage door, the words arriving as lightly as a dropped pin, "is still here. Someone see to it that she finishes before the second remove. I will not have the smell of lye in the dining room." Edith did not lift her head. She had learned in 3 years that stillness was the safest form of dignity available to her. She set her brush in its pail, rose and gathered her bucket and her cloth. The footman, a young man named Barker, who had once accepted a cup of her tea without comment, looked at the wall rather than at her face. What she did not yet know, as she carried her pail down the passage toward the scullery stairs, was that at the far end of the dining room the Earl of Ashcroft had turned his head at the exact moment of Lady Morrow's pronouncement, and that his gaze had traveled, briefly and with an expression no one at the table could read, toward the passage door. She had been 22 years old when her mother died in a hired room in Bath, leaving behind a leather satchel, a worn gold ring, and a debt to the landlady of £4.07. Edith had paid the debt with the last of her own small reserve, and arrived at Ashcroft Park 6 weeks later with the satchel, the ring, and the name Pharaoh, which had been her mother's name before a marriage that the world had not acknowledged, and that Edith had not yet found the means to prove. She had applied for the charwoman's position under that name, with a letter of character from a Bath schoolmistress who had known her mother, and who described her as diligent, educated, and in want of an honest place. The housekeeper, Mrs. Paget, a small spare woman of 60 years, whose face held its judgments in reserve, had read the letter twice and hired her without further inquiry. Mrs. Paget had not asked her surname beyond what was given in the letter. In a household staff of 11, a charwoman was not required to account for herself. This was the one mercy the order of things had extended to Edith in 3 years, and she accepted it with the same quiet attention she brought to everything else. The work itself she did not resent. She had been educated in a schoolroom, had read more widely than was strictly useful to a woman in her position, and understood that the labor of her hands was the only currency she could spend without explanation. She scrubbed the flags of the great hall and the parlor passage. She polished the andirons in the front rooms, and carried coals up the back stairs before the household woke. In the evenings, when the upper floors were occupied and the kitchen had settled into its late quiet, she sat in the corner of the scullery with whatever book she had managed to borrow from the servants' hall shelf and read until the light gave out. The scullery girl was named Nan, and she was 11 years old, and she could not read a single word. Edith had discovered this in her first month, when Nan was given a written note to carry to the cook, and held it at arm's length with the expression of a person confronting a locked door. Edith had taken the note gently from her, read it aloud, and then, on an impulse she could not have fully explained, had spent the next quarter hour showing Nan the shapes of the letters it contained. Nan had not forgotten a single one. After that, the evening instruction became its own ceremony. Nan would bring a stub of tallow and a piece of brown paper, and they would sit at the scrubbed table in the last of the kitchen warmth, while Edith pointed at letters and words with the handle of a spoon, and Nan looked at them with the focused attention of someone who understood even at 11. That knowledge was a thing that could not be taken back. It was, for Edith, the one part of each day that felt entirely her own. She had been engaged in precisely this occupation on the night the Earl came back early from the stables. She heard his boot in the passage first, the heel strike heavier than any footman's, and she looked up from the brown paper with a cold certainty that she had made an error whose cost she had not yet calculated. She held very still. The kitchen door was half open. The candle between her and Nan cast a narrow column of light and then pooled in shadow. And in that shadow, at the edge of the doorframe, she could make out the shape of a man who had stopped walking and was not moving. She could not see his face. She could see his hand on the doorframe, the fingers loose, not gripping. She could see that he was attending. Not inspecting. Attending. Nan, who had noticed nothing, traced a word with her forefinger across the paper and said it aloud in a whisper, and Edith, because there was nothing else to do, said, "Yes, that one exactly." The hand left the doorframe. The boots retreated down the passage, without a word having been spoken, and the kitchen returned to itself. She did not tell Nan. She smoothed the brown paper and pointed at the next word, and her heart was steady by the time the candle burned to its base. The Earl of Ashcroft was 34 years old, and he had held the title for 6 years. And in that time, he had done nothing that anyone could fault and nothing that anyone could warmly praise. He managed the estate with a precision that kept it solvent. He attended the sessions of Parliament with a regularity that kept him visible. He sat at the head of his dinner table with the kind of attentiveness that served, in his world, as the acceptable substitute for warmth. People who had known him before his father's death sometimes remarked to one another, in low voices, that Edward had changed. They did not say in what precise direction, because the direction was difficult to name. He had become, as one acquaintance put it to another, like a room from which the fire has been removed, but whose walls are still standing. His ward, Thomas, was 9 years old and had been living at Ashcroft Park for 2 years, since the deaths of his parents on the Dover Road in a carriage accident that had taken them both in the same hour. He was a slight boy with dark eyes and the manner of a child who has learned to take up as little space as possible. He had been devoted to the pianoforte in his parents' house, but he had not touched the instrument at Ashcroft Park, and no one had asked him to. His uncle attempted, in regular and conscientious intervals, to spend time with him. Thomas received these attempts with a polite and unshakable distance, the way a person receiving a message in a foreign language might listen carefully and still understand nothing. Edward had taken this as evidence of his own incapacity. He had come to believe, in the 2 years since Thomas arrived, that he was precisely the kind of man who drives away the people who have the least power to leave. He had not said so to anyone. He was not a man who said the contents of his own chest aloud. He said it to Edith on an evening in late November in the corridor outside the linen room, because the corridor was empty and the hour was late, and she had just said something honest to him, which was unusual enough that it had opened a door he had meant to keep shut. The exchange had begun, as all their exchanges had begun, in the Register of Household Management. He had stopped her on the corridor to ask about a window latch on the east landing that had been stiff for a week. She had repaired it herself as it happened, with a small tool borrowed from the boot boy, and she told him so, in the level voice she used when she was choosing her words against some inner economy she never quite explained. He had looked at the latch and then at her, with the slight narrowing of attention she had come to recognize. From the rare occasions they occupied the same part of the house. "You repaired it yourself," he said. The carpenter was engaged on the north roof. It required only a small adjustment. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been here, Miss Farrow?" She had told him 3 years, and he had looked at the repaired latch as if the number required some adjustment in his reckoning. If you have found yourself waiting for someone to simply see what has been present all along, leave a word in the comments. This story belongs to all of you who have kept your hands busy and your dignity intact. It was the evening after this exchange that Thomas came to the upstairs corridor for his nightly passage to the nursery and turned away from his uncle's offered hand for the 4th time in as many weeks. Edward had stood in the corridor with his hand still open at his side, and Edith, who had been returning the linen from the room at the end of the hall, had witnessed it and had not made the choice to look away quickly enough. He caught her eye. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "He does not dislike me," Edward said, with the careful evenness of a man reporting something he has examined from every angle. "I am simply not what he needs." She could have agreed with him, which would have been kind in the conventional sense. She said instead, "I do not believe that is true." He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his most unguarded one, which was still a great deal more guarded than other men at their most careful. "You do not know him," he said. "I know that he asks Mrs. Paget about your opinions on things that do not concern him, what books you prefer, whether you rode out in the rain last Thursday. He is not indifferent to you. He is frightened of being refused." The silence that followed this was a different quality from the usual Ashcroft Park silence, which was merely the absence of sound. This one had weight. "I drove away the last person who needed me," Edward said finally, his voice level and uninflected, as though he were reporting a figure from the estate accounts. "My wife. She needed things from me I did not understand how to provide. When she died, I understood them very well." He paused. "I have not trusted myself with the matter since." Edith held the folded linen at her chest and did not move, because she understood that he was not speaking to her so much as at the space between them, in which something true had briefly become possible. She said very quietly, "The difference between you and the men who cannot learn that lesson is that you are still standing in the corridor." His hand had fallen to his side. There was a space of 3 feet between them. She was aware of that space in a way she had not been aware of any physical fact since the morning she had arrived at this house with her mother's satchel. He did not cross it. She had not expected him to. She picked up her linen and walked to the staircase, and she felt his attention on her back all the way to the turning. Lady Morrow had arrived at Ashcroft Park at the beginning of November with 2 trunks, a lady's maid, a conviction that the estate required a mistress by the following spring, and Miss Cecily Vane, who was 20 years old and possessed of every quality that Lady Morrow considered relevant to the question. Cecily was fair, well-connected, accomplished in the ways the season rewarded, and entirely willing to be managed. She sat in the drawing-room each afternoon with her embroidery and her pleasantness, and she spoke to Edward when he was present, with the practiced attention of a woman who had been carefully taught how to be the correct answer. She was not unkind. She was simply arranged. Lady Morrow had spent the first week cataloging what she considered the household's deficiencies, and the second week making her views known to Edward at breakfast, where he listened with the same attentiveness he brought to parliamentary minutes, and agreed to nothing. It was during the 3rd week that she learned the charwoman's surname. She learned it from Barker, the footman, who had heard it from the cook, who had seen Edith's letter of character laid open on Mrs. Fitchel. Paget's desk, on the occasion of some confusion about household accounts. Lady Morrow received this information in the small drawing-room, with the door closed, and a cup of tea cooling at her elbow. And the particular quality of her stillness in that moment was the stillness of a woman recalibrating. She went to Edward the following morning. "There is a woman in your household," she said, "in the private register she reserved for subjects that required management, who is using a false name. The charwoman. She calls herself Pharaoh. Her real surname, I am given to understand, is rather more significant." She allowed the pause to do its work. "The woman is a pretender, Edward. She has placed herself in your household under a concealment, and I have no doubt as to her purpose." Edward looked at his aunt across the breakfast table, with the grey steadiness she had never been able to move by sheer force of confidence. "Her purpose?" he said. "She is an impostor. Whatever claim she imagines herself to have, she has no standing in this house and no business being in it." Lady Morrow set down her cup with a composed deliberateness. "A woman who comes to you under a false name is not a woman of principle." He said nothing. He looked at his aunt for a moment longer and then returned to his correspondence, and Lady Morrow, who had expected at minimum a request for further details, was left with the uncomfortable sense that she had not quite struck the target she intended. That afternoon, Cecily was formally presented to the assembled house party at the winter dinner rehearsal, and Lady Morrow placed her hand at Edward's arm and guided the introduction with the smoothness of long practice. And Edward stood beside Cecily at the drawing-room window, with his hands clasped at his back, and said the correct things in the correct order. Edith watched none of this. She was in the kitchen passage with a bucket, and Nan was spelling the word November with her forefinger in a patch of flour that had been spilled and not yet swept. Mrs. Paget had been unwell since the middle of October. It was not, she insisted, to anyone who inquired, a serious matter. It was a matter of a chest that had grown stubborn, and a fatigue she attributed to the season's demands. Edith saw it differently because she saw Mrs. Paget in the early mornings and the late evenings when the day's performance had been laid aside. And in those hours the woman looked worn through in a way that had nothing to do with cold weather. She sat with her one night in the 3rd week of November, when the cough had kept Mrs. Paget awake until 2 in the morning, and Edith had carried up a warm drink and stayed because leaving felt wrong. They sat in the small room behind the housekeeper's office with a single candle between them, and Mrs. Paget looked at Edith over the rim of her cup, with the expression of a woman coming to a decision she had been deferring for some time. "Your mother came to this house," she said, without preface, "in the summer of 1807. She was 24 years old, and she had been married 6 weeks. The candle did not move. Edith's hands did not move. She was married to the old Earl's second son," Mrs. Paget said, quietly, without the family's knowledge. "He brought her here once to show her the park, and I was the one who saw them in the gallery, and I was the one he asked to keep the matter private until he could bring the family around. He had the marriage recorded and witnessed, and he gave her the certificate himself. He went to France 3 weeks later with his regiment, and he did not come back." Mrs. Paget set down her cup. She reached into the small box on her bedside table, which Edith had seen many times without wondering at its contents, and she removed a folded letter sealed with an old wax impression that had dried to the color of rust. "He sent this before he sailed. I have kept it these 14 years because I did not know where to send it when she moved, and then when I heard she had died, I did not know what to do with it. I did not know you existed until you walked in with your mother's face and your mother's name, and I thought perhaps I was wrong to keep it any longer." Edith took the letter. It was light in her hands, paper and old wax, and 14 years of a secret someone had carried without being asked. "There is a solicitor in London," Mrs. Paget said to Mr. Quill. "His name is on a document filed with the testament of the late Earl. I know because the old Earl found out about his son's marriage shortly before he died, and altered the testament to account for it. And Mr. Quill is the one who holds it. I know this because I was the one the old Earl sent for when he added the codicil." Edith sat with the letter in her hands for a long time after Mrs. Paget slept. She was aware of the sealed impression under her thumb, the faint texture of the 14-year-old wax. She did not open it. She was not yet sure she was permitted to. And in any case, the night seemed too large for what might be inside. She carried the letter to her room and placed it in her mother's satchel beside the gold ring, and lay awake until the house began its early morning sounds. The winter dinner was set for the first Saturday of December. 30 guests. The household had been preparing for a fortnight, the flags scrubbed to silver cleaned, the dining room dressed with greens from the park's kitchen garden and candles enough to illuminate every corner. Edith had contributed to all of it, as she had contributed to every preparatory occasion of the past 3 years, and on the evening itself, she stood in the passage with her apron on and her pail beside her, and listened to the arrivals with the distant equanimity of a person who has made her peace with being outside a room. She was not in the dining room when Lady Morrow spoke. She was at the passage door when she heard her name used. Lady Morrow had not addressed her. Lady Morrow had addressed the assembled table in the measured, carrying voice of a woman who had been waiting for an audience large enough to justify the disclosure, and she had said, in the interval between the first and second remove, that she wished to bring to the company's attention a matter of some delicacy. "There is a woman employed in this household," she said, "under the name Pharaoh. This is not her name. This woman is using the name of a connection. she has no legal right to claim, and she has placed herself in Lord Ashcroft's house, under this concealment, with the intent, I believe, of pressing a claim that she is wholly unequipped to substantiate. She is, in short, an impostor." The silence that followed was the 30-person silence of people who are deciding what their faces should do. Edith pushed the passage door open and stepped into the dining room. She had not planned to do it. She had planned to carry her pail to the scullery stairs and go to bed and let the evening run its course without her. The door had opened under her hand before the plan, and the action had come to any agreement. She stood at the far end of the dining room, in her charwoman's apron, with 30 persons looking at her, and the candles burning as if nothing of consequence had happened. And she looked at Lady Morrow with the steady directness that was, she understood clearly in that moment, the most honest thing she had to offer. "I have been Edith Tharrow for 3 years," she said in a voice that carried the length of the table without being raised. "I used the name I was given by the woman who raised me. I did not use it to deceive anyone of what I was worth. I used it because I knew this house would not have taken me under any other." She let that stand for a moment. Then she said, in the same level tone, "I will remove myself, if that is what is required. I have learned, in 3 years, not to expect otherwise." She turned toward the door. Thomas was standing in the passage doorway. He was 9 years old, and he was in his nightshirt, and he had a letter in both hands, the old wax seal broken because he had opened it, as Edith had asked him before dinner, to bring it to her, if she sent word, and she had not sent word, and he had brought it anyway, because he was 9. Paget had told him it was important, and his face held the particular expression of a child who has acted rightly, without being certain it was permitted. He held it out to Edith. "Mrs. Paget sent it," he said. "She said to give it to you before anyone asked you to leave." Edith took the letter from his hands. She did not read it. She looked at what was inside, only long enough to see the date in her mother's hand and the notation at the top in a different ink. And then she looked up at the dining room and found, without searching, the face of a man standing at the head of the table, who had already taken 3 steps away from his chair. The dining room was very quiet. There are moments in a room full of people when the collective understanding that something irreversible is happening produces a silence more attentive than any single person's attention. This was one of those moments. 30 persons sat or stood with their wine untouched and their conversations dissolved, and they watched Edward cross the length of the dining room toward Edith with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has decided something and sees no reason to disguise the decision. Lady Morrow said at the midpoint of his passage across the room, "Edward, this is not the occasion for," and then she stopped, because he did not stop, and the sentence she had prepared had nowhere to go. He stopped 2 feet from Edith and looked at her for a moment without speaking. She was still holding the letter. Her apron was still on. Her face was level and undefended in the way that had always made him feel in their corridor conversations, that he was being given something that cost her more than she made evident. He turned then and looked at the table, at the 30 persons whose collective assessment of the situation was operating at full capacity. "This woman," he said, the quiet declarative voice that occupied the room, as a duke's voice occupies a room, as a fact occupies a room, "has been educating the household I failed to see for 3 years. She has repaired. What I did not notice was broken. She has sat with the ill and taught the untaught, and conducted herself with more genuine grace than any person at this table has been asked to demonstrate." He paused. And the pause was not for effect, but because he was choosing, with his usual precision, exactly what to say next. "I am asking her to remain, not as an employee, as herself." He looked back at Edith. "Whatever the document confirms," he said, in a voice that had dropped from the public register into something meant for 2 people. "I want you to know that I said this before. I knew what was in it." At the far end of the room, a man rose from his chair with the deliberateness of professional necessity. He was of late middle age, in a dark coat that had traveled from London that afternoon, and he carried a leather case that had been pressed between his elbow and his side since the first remove. "Mr. Prasher." Abner Quill did not require a formal introduction to the room he had once visited, 14 years prior, to witness the filing of a particular codicil to a particular testament. "I am prepared," he said to no one in particular, and to everyone, "to confirm the contents of the late Earl's testament, as amended by codicil dated 14 years ago, and held under seal in my office." Since that time he opened his case. The letter Miss Farrow holds is the marriage record of James Henry Ashcroft and Catherine Farrow, witnessed and dated, which was lodged with my office in the same month. The estate of Ashcroft Park and its appurtenances devolve, under the terms of the codicil, upon the surviving legitimate issue of that marriage. He looked at Edith. "Which is to say, Miss Farrow, they devolve upon you." The silence now was a different animal from the silence that had preceded it. It had the quality of a calculation being revised at 30 simultaneous points. Lady Morrow sat with her fan in her hand at the precise angle at which she had held it throughout the evening, and something in her expression shifted. Not into humiliation, but into the slower and more dignified movement of a person who has been confidently wrong and is now, in the sight of 30 witnesses, adjusting her understanding. She did not speak. She did not need to. The revision was visible. Cecily, beside her, looked at her hands. Edith looked at Edward. He was watching her with the expression she had seen once before at the passage door on the night she taught Nan to read the word November. The expression she had not known how to name then and could name now. It was the expression of a man who has been watching something for a long time, and has finally stopped pretending he was not. "You knew none of this," she said quietly. It was not a question. "I knew nothing of it," he said. "I know something else, and I have been aware of it for longer than I have been willing to credit." She held the letter with both hands and let the room's assessment of her position be what it was, which was, for the first time in 3 years, the truth. If this story has stayed with you, leave a note in the comments. These histories of quiet courage deserve to be witnessed. The winter dinner did not resume in any recognizable form. The guests spoke among themselves in the subdued key of people recalibrating their verdicts, and the second remove was carried in and largely left untouched, and by 9 o'clock the house had settled into the particular atmosphere of an occasion that had arrived somewhere other than planned and was not entirely displeased about it. Edith sat in the small parlor off the library, while Mr. Quill laid the testament's provisions before her, the codicil written in an old man's late-changed hand. The figures clear and the language precise. Ashcroft Park. Its grounds, comprising several hundred acres of managed park and farmland. The contents of the house. A sum in consolidated funds that had been held in trust through Quill's office for 14 years, accruing. She read it carefully, because she had always been careful, and she asked Mr. Quill 3 questions about the precise nature of the entitlement, and received 3 exact answers. And when he had gathered his papers, she sat for a moment with the documents on her knee and the fire crackling beside her. She was still wearing her apron. It was Edward who knocked on the parlor door and, at her word, came in. He did not sit. He stood near the window which held outside it the first genuine snowfall of the winter, the flakes large and unhurried against the dark glass, and he looked at the fire rather than at her for a moment. "Thomas asked to play," he said. "Just now. He asked if he might play the pianoforte before he went to bed." Edith looked up. "He has not asked since his parents died," Edward said. "He came to me and asked." He did not ask Mrs. Paget. He came to the dining room door and asked me. He looked at her now with the directness he had been marshalling and releasing in careful increments across months of corridor conversations. "I believe you told me once that he was not indifferent, only frightened of being refused." "I remember. You were right." He paused. "You have been right about the things that matter, and I have been too accustomed to my own estimate of a situation to correct mine against yours." He turned away from the window and toward her fully. "I should like to have the benefit of your judgment for some considerable time to come, if you are willing to remain in this house under different terms than the ones you entered it." She set the documents on the table beside her. She had not changed, and she had not removed the apron. and the contrast between her and the room around her with its good furniture and its fire was an honest one. She had not yet decided to close the gap, and he was not asking her to close it hastily. "The house," she said, "is apparently mine." He allowed something at the corner of his mouth that, in another man, she might have called a smile. Apparently he said, "You asked before you knew that." "I did." She sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "I should like to hear Thomas play." She found him in the music room with a candle on the pianoforte's ledge, his small hands poised above the keys, with the familiar hesitation of a person beginning something from which they have been absent for a long time. He looked up when she entered, and then at Edward, and then back at the keys, and then he began. It was a simple piece, something learned young with the quality of being not quite remembered, but not quite forgotten either, the notes coming as if from a distance and then settling closer as his hands found their way back to what they had once known, without effort. Edith sat in the chair nearest the fire, and let the music fill the room, and the snow fill the window, and the warmth of the fire fill the space. Around all of it she was still holding her mother's letter in her left hand. She had read it finally while Mr. Quill was organizing his case. It was her father's handwriting, which she had never seen, on paper that had been folded for 14 years. He had written to her mother 4 pages about the park and the gardens, and the particular quality of morning light on the east lawn in summer, and how he had stood at the window that morning, imagining her there. He had written in the last paragraph that whatever the family said, the world would, in time, produce the correct verdict, because correct verdicts had a way of waiting patiently until they were inevitable. Thomas played a second piece, with more confidence, the notes firmer, and the phrases carried through to their ends. Edward stood at the music-room door and watched his nephew, and his face in the firelight was not the face of the man who had sat at the head of 30 dinner tables with his discipline intact and his interior sealed against inquiry. It was a simpler face. It was the face of a man who has been given back something he had concluded was gone. He looked once across the room at Edith. She met his gaze. Neither of them looked away. Outside, the snow continued its patient work on the park. It covered the gravel drive and the kitchen garden and the east lawn where a young man had once stood at a window, imagining a woman he had married in a quiet ceremony and loved, without the world's permission, and it fell on the glass of the music-room window with the same indifference it brought to everything, which was no indifference at all, but only the slow and inevitable falling of what had always been in the air. Thomas finished the piece. He sat for a moment with his hands in his lap looking at the keys. Then he turned and looked at his uncle and said without any of the careful distance that had governed 2 years of corridor encounters, "Was that all right?" Edward crossed the room in 3 steps and sat beside him on the bench and said, "Yes," in a voice that held beneath its single syllable everything he had not known how to give, and was now imperfectly and honestly beginning to learn. Edith unfolded her father's letter one more time, and read the last paragraph again in the firelight. And the words were the same as they had been the first time, patient and plain, and outside the window the snow fell on the park that was hers, and on the house that was hers, and on the life that was, at last, hers to choose.